What if you could flip an invisible switch that would make anyone instantly trust, and want to help you? You can purchase Jack Schafer's revealing book, The Like Switch, through the link in the video description below. Now, let's explore the fascinating psychological techniques that an FBI counterintelligence agent developed to turn strangers into friends and informants. The friendship formula. At the core of the like switch is what Schafer calls the friendship formula. Friendship equals proximity plus frequency plus duration plus intensity. This deceptively simple equation contains profound insights into how human relationships form and develop. Proximity refers to physical closeness. We naturally tend to form friendships with people who are physically near us, classmates, coworkers, and neighbors. This proximity creates opportunities for interaction that wouldn't otherwise exist. In our digital age, virtual proximity through social media and online communities can serve a similar function, though Schafer emphasizes that physical proximity creates stronger bonds. Frequency is how often you interact with someone. Regular, repeated contact builds familiarity and comfort. This explains why we often become friends with people we see daily at work or school, even if we initially had little in common. The more frequently you interact with someone in positive ways, the more likely they are to develop positive feelings toward you. Duration represents the amount of time you spend with someone during each interaction. Longer interactions provide more opportunities to build rapport and share experiences. A 3-hour dinner creates more connection than 3 one-minute conversations spread throughout the day. Quality time matters, and depth often trumps breadth when building relationships. Intensity refers to meeting someone's psychological and emotional needs during your interactions. This might include offering support during difficult times, celebrating their successes, sharing vulnerabilities, or simply being fully present and engaged when you're together. Intensity creates emotional bonds that transform acquaintances into friends and friends into close confidants. Schafer explains that manipulating any of these variables can accelerate friendship formation. If you can't increase proximity, for example, with someone who lives far away, you might compensate by increasing frequency, communicating more often, duration, having longer conversations, or intensity, making those interactions more meaningful and supportive. Understanding this formula gives you a framework for strategically building relationships in any context. Whether you're trying to make friends in a new city, build rapport with colleagues, or deepen existing relationships, you can analyze which elements of the formula need strengthening and focus your efforts accordingly. The beauty of the friendship formula is its versatility. It works in personal and professional contexts, with people from different cultures and backgrounds, and across various types of relationships. By consciously managing these 4 variables, you can systematically transform strangers into acquaintances, acquaintances into friends, and friends into trusted allies. The power of nonverbal cues. While the friendship formula provides the strategic framework for relationship building, nonverbal signals are your tactical tools for making people like you instantly. Schafer spent his FBI career reading and manipulating these signals to gain trust and cooperation from potential informants. He explains that nonverbal cues are particularly powerful because they operate largely below conscious awareness and are processed by the primitive, emotional parts of our brains. The most fundamental nonverbal signal Schafer identifies is what he calls the eyebrow flash. This is the quick, often unconscious raising of the eyebrows upon seeing someone. It happens in a fraction of a second but sends a powerful message. I recognize you and I'm not a threat. When someone gives you an eyebrow flash, they're showing positive recognition. When you give one to others, you're signaling friendliness and openness. Equally important is the genuine smile, what scientists call the Duchenne smile. Unlike fake smiles that involve only the mouth, genuine smiles engage the muscles around the eyes, creating characteristic crow's feet. Our brains are remarkably adept at distinguishing between genuine and forced smiles, even when we can't consciously explain the difference. A genuine smile signals not only friendliness but authenticity, building trust along with liking. Schafer introduces a powerful nonverbal cluster he calls the Big Three: the eyebrow flash, genuine smile, and head tilt. The head tilt, where you slightly angle your head while listening to someone, signals both attention and vulnerability as it exposes the neck. Combined, these three nonverbal cues create an immediate impression of friendliness, interest, and trustworthiness. Practicing these in the mirror can help them become natural responses rather than conscious techniques. Body positioning also sends powerful signals about your intentions and attitudes. Schafer recommends presenting an open posture, uncrossed arms, facing the person directly and leaning slightly forward. This openness signals engagement and receptivity. Conversely, crossed arms, turned away posture, or leaning back can signal disinterest or defensiveness, even if that's not your intention. Mirroring, the subtle matching of another person's body language, tone, and speaking pace, creates unconscious rapport. When done naturally and with a slight delay, mirroring signals similarity and connection. However, Schafer cautions against obvious mirroring, which can seem manipulative or mocking. The goal is to create a sense of being in sync, without the other person consciously noticing the technique. Eye contact is another critical component of nonverbal communication. Too little eye contact can signal disinterest or dishonesty, while too much can feel intimidating or uncomfortable. Schafer recommends maintaining eye contact about 70% of the time while listening and about 50% while speaking. The goal is to show attention without staring, adapting to the other person's comfort level with eye contact. Hand gestures and positioning also influence how you're perceived. Keeping your hands visible, not in pockets or under the table, signals honesty and openness. Using occasional, natural hand gestures while speaking increases your perceived authenticity and helps hold the listener's attention. However, excessive or very large gestures can distract from your message and make you seem nervous or overly dramatic. Schafer emphasizes that nonverbal signals are most effective when they're congruent with your verbal message. Incongruence, saying one thing while your body language suggests another, creates discomfort and suspicion. This is why learning to control and align your nonverbal communication with your intended message is so powerful. When words and body language align, your communication becomes more persuasive and authentic. The friend signal. One of Schafer's most powerful insights from his FBI career is what he calls the friend signal. This simple nonverbal cue can transform how others perceive you and dramatically increase your likability with minimal effort. The friend signal is displayed by exposing your neck, particularly the area where your neck and shoulder meet. This can be accomplished through a head tilt, by touching your neck, or by wearing clothing that exposes this area. In evolutionary terms, exposing the neck signals vulnerability and trust because the neck contains vital blood vessels and the windpipe. Exposing it communicates that you don't view the other person as a threat. When you display the friend signal, you trigger an unconscious response in others. They instinctively categorize you as non-threatening and potentially friendly. This instant categorization bypasses conscious thought processes and activates positive emotional responses. The beauty of this technique is its simplicity and subtlety. Most people won't consciously notice you're doing it, but they'll feel more comfortable around you without knowing why. Schafer describes how he used the friend signal extensively during his FBI career to build rapport with potential informants. By slightly tilting his head during conversations, he could transform tense interactions into more relaxed, open exchanges. This subtle shift often made the difference between getting cooperation and facing resistance. Beyond the neck exposure, the friend signal includes maintaining an open posture, keeping your hands visible and unclenched, and avoiding aggressive stances. Together, these elements create an impression of approachability and trustworthiness that operates on a primal level of human psychology. The power of the friend signal lies in its ability to bypass conscious defenses. Even people who are initially suspicious or resistant will find it difficult to maintain those feelings when faced with consistent friend signals. Their emotional brains recognize and respond to these cues before their rational minds can intervene. Schafer recommends practicing the friend signal until it becomes natural. Start by using the head tilt when listening to others speak. Notice how this simple adjustment often leads to more open, comfortable conversations. As you become more comfortable with this technique, incorporate other elements like neck touches or clothing choices that naturally expose the neck area. What makes the friend signal particularly valuable is that it works across cultures. While many verbal and some nonverbal cues vary internationally, the basic friend signals are recognized universally. This makes them invaluable tools for building rapport in cross-cultural contexts where language or cultural barriers might otherwise create obstacles. The practical power of empathy. Empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of another, is often discussed as a moral virtue. Schafer approaches it as a practical skill that can be developed and deployed strategically to build relationships and influence others. His FBI background gives him a unique perspective on empathy as a tool rather than merely an emotional state. Schafer breaks empathy down into components that can be practiced. First is attentive listening, which goes beyond simply hearing words to understanding the emotional content behind them. This involves maintaining eye contact, providing verbal and nonverbal feedback that shows you're engaged, and resisting the urge to mentally prepare your response while the other person is still speaking. When you truly listen, people feel valued and understood, which naturally increases their liking for you. Second is validation, acknowledging the other person's feelings and experiences as legitimate, even if you don't necessarily agree with their conclusions. Phrases like, "That sounds really challenging," or "I can understand why you'd feel that way," validate emotions without requiring agreement. This validation satisfies a fundamental human need to have our experiences recognized and respected. Third is asking thoughtful questions that show genuine interest in the other person's perspective. These questions should be open-ended, encouraging elaboration rather than yes/no answers. They should also build on what the person has already shared, demonstrating that you've been paying attention. Thoughtful questions not only gather information but signal respect for the other person's viewpoint. Schafer explains that empathy creates a powerful psychological effect he calls the empathy loop. When you demonstrate empathy towards someone, they naturally begin to feel empathy toward you in return. This mutual understanding creates a positive feedback cycle that rapidly strengthens relationships. In his FBI work, creating this empathy loop often transformed reluctant contacts into willing informants. Beyond these components, Schafer recommends a technique he calls empathic statements, verbalizing what you believe the other person is feeling. For example, "You seem frustrated with how that situation was handled," or "You must be really proud of that accomplishment." When accurate, these statements create an almost magical effect, making the person feel deeply understood. Even when slightly off target, they typically appreciate the attempt to understand and will often correct you, providing even more insight into their perspective. What separates Schafer's approach from conventional advice about empathy is his emphasis on its strategic application. He recommends practicing empathic techniques even in brief, seemingly unimportant interactions, with cashiers, taxi drivers, or people in elevators. These low-stakes situations build your empathy muscles for when you need to deploy these skills in more important contexts. Crucially, Schafer distinguishes between feeling empathy and showing empathy. While genuinely feeling what others feel is valuable, the practical benefits come from demonstrating empathic behaviors that make others feel understood. This distinction allows you to practice empathy as a skill rather than waiting for spontaneous emotional responses. The practical power of empathy extends beyond individual relationships to group dynamics. Leaders who demonstrate empathy build stronger teams with higher morale and productivity. Salespeople who employ empathic techniques achieve better results by understanding customer needs. Negotiators who use empathy gain insight into the other party's priorities, enabling more favorable agreements for all involved. The power of the right questions. Questions are powerful tools for building rapport, gathering information, and directing conversations. Schafer, drawing on his experience as an FBI agent skilled in elicitation techniques, provides a sophisticated framework for asking questions that build relationships while extracting valuable information. He begins by distinguishing between closed and open questions. Closed questions can be answered with a simple yes or no, and typically begin with words like do, are, or will. While these questions have their place, particularly for confirming specific details, they limit conversation and put pressure on you to continuously generate new questions. Open questions, by contrast, invite elaboration and typically begin with how, what, why, where, or who. These questions empower the other person to share more extensively, revealing valuable information while making them feel their opinions and experiences are valued. For example, rather than asking, "Did you enjoy the conference?" Closed, you might ask, "What were the most valuable aspects of the conference for you?" Open. Schafer introduces a particularly powerful questioning technique he calls the reciprocity of liking. This approach involves asking questions that presuppose a positive relationship. For example, "What do you find most interesting about your work?" presupposes your interest in their perspective, which activates a psychological tendency to return positive feelings. These questions make the other person feel valued while encouraging them to share information freely. Another technique Schafer recommends is asking questions that allow people to display their expertise or knowledge. Most people enjoy being recognized as knowledgeable in their areas of interest or expertise. Questions like, "How did you develop such expertise in digital marketing?" or "What's your perspective on this industry trend?" allow the person to share their knowledge while feeling respected and valued. Timing questions strategically enhances their effectiveness. Schafer suggests starting interactions with lighter, less personal questions before gradually progressing to more substantive ones as rapport develops. This onion layer approach respects psychological boundaries while systematically building deeper connection through progressive self-disclosure. The phrasing of questions significantly impacts how they're received. Schafer cautions against accusatory questions that create defensiveness. For example, "Why didn't you complete that report on time?" puts the person on the defensive. Reframing this as, "What obstacles did you encounter with that report?" invites explanation without implying fault. Schafer also recommends echoing as a powerful questioning technique. This involves repeating the last few words of someone's statement with an inquisitive tone, encouraging them to elaborate without asking an explicit question. For example, if someone says, "The project was challenging due to the tight deadline," you might simply repeat, "The tight deadline." This minimal prompt often elicits further explanation while demonstrating your attentiveness to what they've shared. One of the most sophisticated questioning approaches Schafer describes is the presumptive question. This involves phrasing questions that presuppose certain information, making it easier for the person to confirm or correct rather than having to volunteer information from scratch. For example, instead of asking, "Have you had problems with your manager?" which might create defensiveness, you might ask, "What aspects of your manager's style have been most challenging to adapt to?" This presupposes that there have been some challenges, which is true in virtually any working relationship, while making it safe to discuss them. The power of questioning extends beyond information gathering to relationship building. Well-crafted questions demonstrate interest, create opportunities for the other person to feel valued, and direct conversation toward mutually beneficial topics. By mastering the art of asking the right questions in the right way at the right time, you can simultaneously build rapport and gather valuable insights. Building rapport through self-disclosure. Strategic self-disclosure, sharing information about yourself, is one of the most powerful tools for building rapport and trust. Schafer's approach to self-disclosure is more nuanced and strategic than the common advice to open up to others. Drawing on psychological research and his FBI experience, he explains how calibrated self-disclosure can accelerate relationship development while maintaining appropriate boundaries. The principle underlying effective self-disclosure is reciprocity. When you share something about yourself, particularly something slightly personal, it creates social pressure on the other person to reciprocate with a disclosure of their own. This exchange initiates what psychologists call the disclosure loop, where mutual sharing progressively deepens the relationship. Schafer recommends starting with low-risk disclosures, information that isn't particularly private or vulnerable but gives a sense of who you are. This might include hobbies, general work experiences, or basic family information. These initial disclosures serve as relationship test balloons, helping you gauge the other person's receptiveness to deeper connection. The timing and context of self-disclosure significantly impact its effectiveness. Premature or excessive disclosure can overwhelm the other person and seem inappropriate. Schafer recommends matching the intimacy level of your disclosures to the established closeness of the relationship, gradually increasing depth as rapport builds. This progressive disclosure approach aligns with how natural friendships develop. One particularly effective form of self-disclosure involves sharing minor vulnerabilities or mistakes. Contrary to the belief that projecting perfect competence builds respect, research shows that the pratfall effect often makes people more likable. Admitting to small mistakes or weaknesses makes you seem more human and approachable. The key is selecting vulnerabilities that don't undermine fundamental competence or trustworthiness, sharing that you got lost on the way to the meeting, for example, rather than admitting to major ethical lapses. Schafer introduces the concept of disclosure hooks, pieces of information you share that invite the other person to ask follow-up questions or share related experiences. For example, mentioning that you recently returned from a trip to Japan might prompt questions about your experiences there, or lead the other person to share their own travel stories. These hooks create natural conversation bridges that facilitate mutual disclosure. The content of your disclosures should be calibrated to the specific person and context. Schafer recommends looking for areas of similarity or shared experience, as people naturally bond over common ground. However, differences can also create interesting conversation opportunities when approached with curiosity rather than judgment. Humor, particularly self-deprecating humor, can be a powerful form of disclosure that builds rapport. When you can laugh at yourself in appropriate ways, it demonstrates confidence, authenticity, and lack of pretension. Schafer cautions, however, that humor should be used carefully, avoiding potentially offensive topics and adapting to the other person's humor style. Even while advocating strategic self-disclosure, Schafer emphasizes maintaining appropriate boundaries. The goal isn't to create false intimacy or share everything about yourself, but to selectively disclose information that builds connection while aligning with your personal and professional goals. Effective self-disclosure builds relationships without compromising privacy or dignity. What makes Schafer's approach distinctive is its focus on intentionality. Rather than random sharing, he recommends thinking about what specific disclosures might help build rapport with a particular person in a particular context. This strategic approach transforms self-disclosure from a passive, reactive process into a powerful tool for relationship building. Reading and managing others' emotions. A critical aspect of interpersonal effectiveness is the ability to read others' emotional states and respond appropriately. Schafer combines psychological research with practical techniques from his FBI background to explain how you can accurately identify emotions and use this information to build stronger connections. The foundation of emotional reading begins with observing baseline behavior. Everyone has normal patterns of expression, movement, and speech that constitute their emotional baseline. Meaningful emotional signals become apparent when you notice deviations from this baseline. This requires paying attention to how someone typically behaves before trying to interpret changes in their emotional state. Facial expressions provide the most immediate emotional information. Schafer explains that while people can control their macroexpressions, sustained facial expressions, microexpressions, fleeting expressions that last fractions of a second, often reveal true feelings before being suppressed. Learning to spot these quick flashes of emotion gives you insight into what someone is really feeling beneath their controlled presentation. Body language offers additional emotional cues. Schafer identifies several reliable indicators. Compressed lips often signal disagreement or disapproval, even when someone verbally expresses agreement. Crossed arms frequently indicate defensiveness or closed-mindedness. Leaning away typically suggests discomfort or disagreement. Foot direction reveals genuine interest. People point their feet toward what they find engaging and away from what they don't. Voice qualities such as pitch, pace, and volume also convey emotional information. Higher pitch often indicates stress or excitement, while lower pitch typically signals confidence or authority. Increased speaking pace might suggest anxiety or enthusiasm, while slowed speech often indicates careful consideration or hesitation. These vocal cues often reveal emotions that words themselves might conceal. Once you've accurately read someone's emotional state, Schafer offers techniques for responding effectively. The most fundamental approach is validation, acknowledging the legitimacy of their feelings without necessarily agreeing with their perspective. Simple phrases like, "I can see why you'd feel that way," or "that sounds really frustrating," validate emotions without judgment. For negative emotions, Schafer recommends the acknowledge and redirect technique. This involves briefly acknowledging the negative feeling before gently steering the conversation toward more constructive territory. For example, "I understand you're disappointed with the project results. What aspects do you think we could improve next time?" This approach respects feelings while moving toward solutions. When someone is experiencing strong emotions, Schafer advises against offering immediate solutions or minimizing their feelings. Instead, he recommends holding the emotional space, simply listening attentively and validating their experience. This patience often allows emotional intensity to naturally diminish, creating space for more productive conversation. Schafer introduces the concept of emotional contagion, the tendency for emotions to spread between people. By consciously managing your own emotional expression, you can influence others' emotional states. Displaying calm confidence when others are anxious, for example, can help reduce collective stress levels. This isn't about suppressing authentic feelings, but about strategically expressing emotions that facilitate positive interactions. For particularly challenging conversations, Schafer recommends emotional labeling, explicitly naming the emotion you perceive. For example, "You seem frustrated with how this process has been handled." When accurate, this demonstrates empathy and often diffuses negative emotions by showing the person they're understood. Even when your perception is incorrect, the person will typically clarify their actual feelings, deepening your understanding of their perspective. The ability to accurately read and appropriately respond to emotions creates what Schafer calls emotional resonance, a state where people feel genuinely understood and connected. This resonance builds trust and rapport more quickly than almost any other interpersonal skill, making emotional intelligence a cornerstone of effective relationship building. Establishing trust and credibility. Trust is the foundation of meaningful relationships and effective influence. Schafer approaches trust building not as an abstract concept, but as a set of specific behaviors and techniques that can be systematically applied. His FBI background gives him unique insight into establishing trust even in initially skeptical or resistant individuals. The cornerstone of trust building is consistency between words and actions. Schafer emphasizes that trustworthiness is demonstrated through behavioral congruence, doing what you say you'll do when you say you'll do it. This consistency creates predictability, which is essential for trust. Even small broken promises significantly damage credibility, while consistent follow-through builds a reputation for reliability. Competence forms another pillar of trust. People naturally trust those who demonstrate capability in relevant areas. Schafer recommends selectively showcasing your competence through actions rather than claims. Solving problems, providing valuable insights, or demonstrating skills builds credibility more effectively than asserting expertise. However, he cautions against appearing infallible, as acknowledging appropriate limitations actually enhances perceived honesty. Transparency about motives and processes significantly impacts trust formation. Schafer advocates explaining your reasoning and being forthright about your interests rather than appearing mysterious or manipulative. When people understand why you're asking questions or proposing certain approaches, they're more likely to trust your intentions even when your interests don't perfectly align with theirs. Personal disclosure, when properly calibrated, accelerates trust development. Schafer explains that sharing appropriate vulnerabilities signals trust in the other person, typically triggering reciprocal trust. The key is selecting disclosures that demonstrate authenticity without undermining competence. For example, sharing challenges you've overcome shows both humanity and resilience, building connection without diminishing credibility. Body language plays a crucial role in establishing trustworthiness. Schafer identifies several nonverbal trust signals. Maintaining comfortable eye contact without staring. Keeping hands visible rather than hidden. Presenting an open posture without crossed arms. Speaking at a measured pace with appropriate pauses. Maintaining appropriate physical distance. These nonverbal cues are processed largely unconsciously, creating impressions of trustworthiness before conscious evaluation occurs. Schafer introduces the concept of trust testing, small opportunities for the other person to verify your reliability. For example, you might make a small promise and fulfill it promptly, establishing a pattern of reliability. These trust tests function as low-risk verification opportunities, allowing the relationship to progressively deepen as trust is confirmed through experience. Active listening serves as another powerful trust-building tool. When you demonstrate that you truly understand someone's perspective through appropriate questions, thoughtful responses, and accurate paraphrasing, they naturally feel a stronger connection. This understanding creates what Schafer calls cognitive trust, the belief that you comprehend their situation and viewpoint. For professional contexts, Schafer recommends establishing swift trust through credentials, third-party endorsements, and institutional affiliations. These external validations provide shortcuts to initial credibility when there isn't time to build trust organically. However, he emphasizes that this provisional trust must be reinforced through consistent trustworthy behavior to become sustainable. When trust has been damaged, Schafer outlines a systematic approach to rebuilding it. This process begins with taking full responsibility rather than offering excuses, continues with concrete actions to rectify the situation, and concludes with consistent behavior that gradually restores confidence. The key insight is that rebuilding trust typically requires significantly more evidence than establishing it initially, a reality that underscores the importance of maintaining trust once established. What distinguishes Schafer's approach to trust is its practicality and specificity. Rather than viewing trust as an abstract quality that either exists or doesn't, he presents it as the product of concrete behaviors that can be systematically implemented and refined. This actionable perspective transforms trust from a hopeful aspiration into a strategic goal that can be methodically achieved. The curiosity factor and interest hooks. Curiosity is one of the most powerful drivers of human behavior. Schafer explains how strategically triggering curiosity can make people more interested in you and more engaged in your interactions. His approach transforms curiosity from a passive emotional state into an active tool for building relationships and influence. The fundamental principle Schafer identifies is that humans are naturally drawn to moderate mystery. When something is slightly puzzling or incomplete, our brains naturally want to resolve the ambiguity and complete the picture. Too much mystery creates anxiety and disengagement, while too little fails to capture interest. The sweet spot is what Schafer calls strategic ambiguity, revealing enough to create interest while withholding enough to stimulate curiosity. Schafer introduces the concept of interest hooks, statements or questions designed to trigger curiosity. These hooks create information gaps that the other person is motivated to fill. For example, instead of directly stating your profession, you might say, "I help companies protect their most valuable assets," prompting questions about what you actually do. These hooks transform mundane information exchange into engaging conversation. Stories with strategic gaps work similarly. When you tell a story but leave out a crucial detail or the conclusion, the listener becomes invested in discovering the missing information. Schafer explains that this technique was valuable in his FBI work, as partial disclosures often prompted contacts to ask questions that led to productive conversations they might otherwise have avoided. Questions can function as powerful curiosity triggers. Schafer recommends occasionally asking unexpected or slightly unusual questions that make people pause and reflect. For example, rather than asking, "How long have you worked here?" you might ask, "What's the most interesting project you've worked on since joining the company?" These thought-provoking questions engage deeper cognitive processing and create more memorable interactions. Physical objects can also serve as curiosity triggers. Schafer suggests occasionally using unusual or interesting items, a unique watch, distinctive accessories, or conversation piece objects that naturally prompt questions. These tangible interest hooks create organic openings for meaningful conversation without appearing forced or artificial. The strategic revelation of information timing matters significantly. Schafer advocates occasionally breaking expected patterns of disclosure. For example, when asked a question, you might briefly acknowledge it before completing your previous thought, then return to answer the question. This slight deviation from conversational norms creates engagement through unpredictability, while still maintaining appropriate responsiveness. For ongoing relationships, Schafer recommends what he calls curiosity maintenance, strategically introducing new information or skills over time rather than revealing everything about yourself at once. This gradual unfolding maintains interest and gives relationships room to develop depth through continued discovery. Schafer distinguishes between healthy curiosity triggering and manipulative mystery. The key difference is intention. Ethical curiosity techniques aim to create genuine engagement and mutual discovery, while manipulative approaches seek to extract information without reciprocity or to create artificial scarcity. The goal should be creating authentic interest, not manufacturing false intrigue. Social media provides additional opportunities for curiosity application. Schafer suggests occasionally posting intriguing questions, partial stories that will be completed later, or images that prompt questions. These digital interest hooks extend your curiosity-generating approach beyond in-person interactions to your broader social network. By systematically incorporating curiosity triggers into your communication, you transform ordinary interactions into engaging exchanges that naturally deepen connection. The power of curiosity lies in its ability to shift the other person from passive reception to active engagement. They become investors in the conversation rather than merely recipients of information. Creating and maintaining rapport in the digital age. While many relationship principles remain constant regardless of medium, digital communication presents unique challenges and opportunities for building rapport. Schafer provides a framework for establishing and maintaining connection in digital contexts, from email and texting to social media and video calls. The fundamental challenge of digital communication is the reduction of nonverbal cues. Without access to facial expressions, body language, and vocal tonality, misinterpretation becomes more likely. Schafer recommends compensating for this limitation through several strategies. First, increase the clarity and specificity of your language. What might be obvious in person often needs explicit articulation in digital formats. This includes being more precise about intentions, emotions, and expectations than might be necessary face-to-face. Second, use appropriate digital substitutes for nonverbal cues. These include emoticons, GIFs, or brief phrases that signal tone. While these can't fully replace in-person nonverbals, they provide important emotional context that reduces misunderstanding. Schafer cautions, however, against overusing these in professional contexts where they might undermine credibility. Third, adapt the principles of progressive disclosure to digital formats. Just as in-person relationships deepen gradually, digital relationships should follow a similar progression from lighter exchanges to more substantive ones. Schafer warns against premature intimacy or disclosure in digital contexts, where the illusion of connection can sometimes run ahead of actual relationship development. For video calls specifically, Schafer offers practical techniques to maximize rapport. Position your camera at eye level to create the impression of direct eye contact. Ensure proper lighting that shows your face clearly, preferably with light coming from in front rather than behind you. Minimize distracting backgrounds or movements that divide attention. Occasionally look directly at the camera, not just the screen, to create moments of perceived eye contact. Use slightly more animated facial expressions and vocal variety to compensate for the flattening effect of video. Email communication presents different challenges. Schafer recommends personalizing messages with small details that show individualized attention. He also suggests occasional use of the curiosity principle by creating information gaps that encourage response. For important or potentially sensitive discussions, he advises writing emails, then waiting before sending them, allowing time to reconsider tone and content. Social media platforms offer unique opportunities for relationship maintenance through what Schafer calls ambient awareness, the ability to stay updated on others' lives without direct interaction. He recommends occasional meaningful engagement with others' content rather than passive consumption or superficial responses. This strategic engagement maintains connection between more substantial interactions. For building new relationships digitally, Schafer advocates gradual progression through communication channels. Moving from public forums to private messages, then to video calls, and eventually to in-person meetings represents a natural evolution that builds trust at each stage. Rushing this progression can create discomfort, while moving too slowly might allow momentum to dissipate. Digital communication also offers unique advantages. The asynchronous nature of many platforms allows for more thoughtful composition than spontaneous in-person interaction. Geographic and time zone barriers become less relevant, enabling relationships that wouldn't otherwise be possible. The ability to share content directly creates additional connection points beyond conversation itself. Schafer emphasizes the importance of authenticity across platforms. While you might adjust your communication style for different contexts, presenting radically different personas across platforms creates cognitive dissonance when these worlds inevitably intersect. Consistency of character, if not exact communication style, builds sustainable trust. Perhaps most importantly, Schafer reminds us that digital communication works best as a supplement to, not a replacement for, in-person interaction when possible. The richness of face-to-face communication creates deeper bonds than digital interaction alone. When geography permits, Online rapport should ideally be reinforced through occasional in-person contact that activates all the nonverbal channels that strengthen human connection. Practical applications in various contexts. The principles of likability and influence apply across contexts, but their specific application varies by situation. Schafer provides tailored guidance for applying these techniques in different settings, from professional environments to social situations to challenging relationships. In professional settings, Schafer recommends focusing on competence-based likability rather than purely personal connection. Demonstrating reliability, solving problems, and adding value create professional rapport more effectively than focusing exclusively on personal commonalities. He suggests using the curiosity principle by occasionally mentioning projects or skills that might interest colleagues without detailed elaboration, creating natural openings for work-related conversations that build connection. For job interviews specifically, Schafer advises researching the company culture to adapt your rapport-building approach appropriately. In formal environments, connection might be established through shared professional values, while more casual cultures might welcome personal anecdotes. The key is calibrating your self-presentation to the specific organizational context while maintaining authenticity. Leadership positions require a balanced approach to likability. Schafer explains that effective leaders combine warmth with competence, using rapport-building techniques to create connection while maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. The friendship formula applies differently in leadership contexts. Proximity and frequency happen naturally, making the quality of interactions, duration, and intensity particularly important for building team cohesion. In social settings, Schafer recommends leading with curiosity rather than impressive self-disclosure. Asking thoughtful questions and showing genuine interest creates more positive impressions than attempting to impress through achievements or status signals. For group situations specifically, he suggests briefly connecting individually with each person while maintaining engagement with the group as a whole. Dating and romantic relationships benefit from strategic application of likability principles. Schafer emphasizes the importance of progressive self-disclosure, revealing depths gradually rather than overwhelming with premature intimacy. He recommends creating shared experiences that build connection through mutual engagement rather than focusing exclusively on conversation, as activities create natural opportunities for displaying positive qualities indirectly. Challenging relationships, including those with difficult colleagues or strained family dynamics, require modified approaches. Schafer advises beginning with small, non-threatening interactions that gradually build positive association. In these contexts, consistency becomes particularly important. Even small positive interactions, repeated over time, can gradually transform negative relationships through the psychological principle of conditioning. For cross-cultural interactions, Schafer emphasizes the importance of research and observation. While some nonverbal signals, like the genuine smile, work universally, others vary significantly across cultures. Before important cross-cultural meetings, he recommends learning culture-specific rapport signals and potential taboos. However, he notes that expressing sincere interest in understanding cultural differences itself creates positive connection, as people generally appreciate efforts to respect their cultural background. Parent-child relationships benefit from applying these principles developmentally. With young children, Schafer recommends emphasizing nonverbal connection through play and physical proximity. For adolescents, respecting autonomy while maintaining connection requires more sophisticated application, asking questions that show interest without intrusion and offering support without controlling. The friendship formula elements of proximity and frequency happen naturally in families, making the quality of interaction, duration, and intensity the differentiating factor in relationship strength. Sales and persuasion contexts powerfully demonstrate these principles in action. Schafer explains that customers buy from people they like and trust, often making decisions based on rapport rather than purely rational analysis. He recommends focusing first on establishing connection before attempting persuasion. The most effective sales professionals create genuine relationships where helping the customer naturally aligns with the sales process rather than treating rapport merely as a manipulation technique. Conflict resolution represents a particularly valuable application area. Schafer explains that likability techniques can de-escalate tension and create space for productive problem-solving. In conflicts, he recommends beginning with validation of the other person's perspective, without necessarily agreeing with their conclusions, before introducing alternative viewpoints. This emotional recognition often transforms combative interactions into collaborative ones. For public speaking and group presentations, Schafer offers modified approaches for building collective rapport. These include establishing individual connections before and after formal presentations, using inclusive language that builds group identity, and demonstrating respect for audience time and attention. He notes that audiences respond more positively to speakers they perceive as authentic and attentive to their needs than to those who merely display polish or expertise. Online communities and remote teams present unique application challenges. Schafer recommends establishing presence through consistent, valuable contributions rather than frequency alone. In digital group contexts, acknowledging and supporting others' contributions builds rapport more effectively than focusing primarily on your own visibility. For remote teams specifically, he suggests creating structured opportunities for the informal interaction that builds relationship in traditional workplaces. The ethics of influence. Schafer directly addresses the ethical dimensions of applying these influence techniques. As a former FBI agent who used these methods professionally, he provides a nuanced perspective on the boundary between ethical influence and manipulation. The core ethical principle Schafer identifies is intention. Using rapport techniques to build genuine relationships and create mutual benefit differs fundamentally from employing the same techniques to exploit others. The techniques themselves are neutral tools. Their ethical status depends on the goals they serve and whether they involve deception or respect for autonomy. Transparency represents another key ethical consideration. Schafer distinguishes between strategic rapport building, where you selectively emphasize authentic aspects of yourself to build connection, and deceptive manipulation, where you present a false persona or manufactured commonalities. While you needn't disclose that you're consciously applying rapport techniques, the qualities you present should be genuine. Schafer emphasizes that sustainable influence requires actual value creation. Techniques that build initial liking without substance ultimately fail as the relationship develops. True influence emerges from the combination of likability with competence, integrity, and mutual benefit. The most effective application of these principles involves becoming genuinely more attuned to others rather than simply appearing to be. The power differential in relationships affects ethical considerations. When interacting with those over whom you have authority, employees, students, or others in dependent positions, the responsibility to avoid exploitation increases. In these contexts, Schafer recommends greater emphasis on transparency and explicit consent, particularly when influence techniques might affect significant decisions. Cultural and contextual expectations also shape ethical boundaries. What constitutes appropriate influence varies across professional, social, and cultural contexts. Behavior considered normal relationship building in sales might seem manipulative in healthcare, while practices acceptable in some cultures might violate expectations in others. Ethical application requires sensitivity to these contextual norms. Schafer acknowledges the reality that these skills can be misused. However, he argues that understanding these principles actually provides protection against manipulation by others. When you recognize influence techniques being employed inappropriately, you can make more conscious choices about your response rather than reacting automatically to skillful manipulation. Rather than avoiding influence skills due to ethical concerns, Schafer advocates developing them with ethical intention. In a world where these techniques are widely used by advertisers, politicians, salespeople, and others with various motives, understanding and ethically applying them allows you to build positive relationships while protecting yourself from exploitation. Turning enemies into friends. Some of the most powerful applications of likability principles involve transforming negative relationships into positive ones. Schafer provides a systematic approach to this challenging process based on psychological principles and his experience turning hostile contacts into cooperative sources during his FBI career. The foundation of relationship transformation is understanding that most negative reactions stem from perceived threat. When people respond to you with hostility, suspicion, or avoidance, they typically feel threatened in some way. Their status, autonomy, values, or self-image seems at risk. Recognizing the specific threat they perceive gives you the starting point for transformation. Schafer introduces the threat reduction model for initial interactions with difficult individuals. This approach focuses on systematically removing perception of threat before attempting to build positive connection. Key elements include non-threatening body language, relaxed posture, appropriate distance, calm movements. Validation of concerns without necessarily agreeing with conclusions. Respect for autonomy by offering choices rather than demands. Status acknowledgement through appropriate deference to expertise or position. Value recognition by sincerely acknowledging the legitimate aspects of their perspective. Once threat perception diminishes, Schafer recommends the small wins approach to building positive association. This involves creating minor positive interactions with minimal risk of rejection. These small positive exchanges might be as simple as brief, pleasant greetings, minor requests for easily provided assistance, or short conversations on neutral topics. The cumulative effect of these interactions gradually retrains the brain's response through conditioning. For relationships damaged by specific incidents, Schafer outlines a structured repair process. This begins with responsibility acknowledgement, openly recognizing your contribution to the problem without qualification or excuse. The second step is making amends through concrete actions that demonstrate commitment to change rather than merely verbal apologies. Finally, consistent behavior change rebuilds trust over time, recognizing that repair typically requires more evidence of change than initial relationship formation. Particularly valuable is Schafer's insight on transforming competitive relationships into collaborative ones. He recommends identifying superordinate goals, objectives that require cooperation to achieve, as bridging mechanisms. When former adversaries must work together toward shared outcomes, cooperation often develops despite initial resistance, creating opportunities for relationship reset. The timing of transformation efforts significantly impacts success. Schafer identifies unfreezing moments, situations where established patterns become temporarily fluid due to changes in context, roles, or external circumstances. These transitions provide unique opportunities for relationship redefinition, as habitual responses haven't yet established in the new context. For deeply entrenched negative relationships, Schafer suggests the third-party bridge approach. This involves establishing connection through mutual positive relationships with a third person who can facilitate interaction, vouch for your intentions, and create context for positive exchange. This indirect pathway often proves effective when direct approaches meet consistent resistance. Particularly challenging are relationships where you've been categorized as an enemy, rather than merely a difficult individual. In these situations, Schafer recommends focusing initially on recategorization, moving from the enemy category to a neutral one before attempting to establish positive connection. This often requires demonstrating that you don't fit the stereotyped characteristics associated with the enemy category. Throughout this transformation process, Schafer emphasizes patience and realistic expectations. Negative relationships typically transform gradually rather than suddenly, often following a nonlinear path with occasional setbacks. The progression generally moves from active hostility to neutral tolerance to cautious cooperation before reaching genuine positive connection. Recognizing and appreciating incremental improvements sustains momentum through this extended process. The science behind the like switch. While Schafer presents his techniques in practical, actionable terms, he also grounds them in scientific research from psychology, neuroscience, and evolutionary biology. Understanding this scientific foundation provides deeper insight into why these approaches work and how they can be most effectively applied. The evolutionary basis for many likability cues traces to our development as social primates. Behaviors that signal friend, not foe, provided survival advantages in our evolutionary history. The friend signal, for example, exposes vulnerable areas, particularly the neck, that would be protected in the presence of perceived threats. This evolutionary programming remains active in our modern brains, creating instant, unconscious categorization of others as potential friends or threats based on these ancient signals. Neurologically, these friendship signals activate different brain regions than threat signals. When we perceive friend signals, the brain's reward centers activate, releasing dopamine and creating positive association. Threat signals, conversely, activate the amygdala and stress response systems, triggering avoidance and defensive reactions. By consistently displaying friend signals, you can literally change how the other person's brain responds to your presence. The psychological principle of conditioning underlies many relationship development techniques. Through repeated association of your presence with positive experiences, you create unconscious positive responses. This explains why consistent small positive interactions eventually transform relationships. They recondition the brain's association patterns over time. This conditioning occurs largely unconsciously, often changing feelings before conscious attitudes shift. Cognitive dissonance theory explains another powerful aspect of relationship transformation. When people do favors for you through the principle of asking for help, they often unconsciously adjust their attitudes to maintain consistency between their actions and beliefs. The reasoning follows: I help this person, therefore I must like them at least somewhat. This psychological mechanism helps explain why asking for small favors often proves more effective for building rapport than doing favors. Mirror neurons play a significant role in the effectiveness of mirroring techniques. These specialized brain cells activate both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing the same action. When you subtly mirror another person's body language, their mirror neurons create a neural simulation of your movements, generating feelings of similarity and connection at a neurological level. The psychological need for validation explains the power of empathic responses. Research consistently shows that feeling understood activates reward centers in the brain similar to those triggered by primary rewards like food or money. When you demonstrate understanding through validation, you satisfy this fundamental psychological need, creating positive association and opening pathways for influence. Schafer also connects his techniques to established psychological concepts like the mere exposure effect, increased liking through familiarity, cognitive ease, preference for information that's easily processed, and psychological reactance, resistance to perceived threats to autonomy. By working with these established psychological principles rather than against them, his approaches align with how the brain naturally functions. The science of first impressions particularly supports Schafer's emphasis on nonverbal signals. Research shows that initial impressions form within seconds, are heavily influenced by nonverbal cues, and tend to persist through subsequent interactions. These findings explain why mastering nonverbal friend signals proves so important for initial rapport establishment, as these signals shape how all subsequent interaction is interpreted. Recent advances in neuroscience confirm that emotional processing typically precedes and influences rational thought. This explains why establishing emotional connection often proves more effective for influence than purely logical appeals. When positive emotional association exists, logical arguments receive more favorable consideration. Without this emotional foundation, even sound reasoning often faces resistance. Understanding this scientific basis doesn't diminish the practical value of these techniques, but enhances it. By recognizing the underlying mechanisms, you can apply these approaches more flexibly and effectively across diverse situations rather than following rigid formulas. The science explains not just what works, but why it works and how it can be adapted to specific contexts. Turning likability into influence. While likability itself has value, Schafer extends his analysis to show how it serves as the foundation for broader influence. He distinguishes between being liked, a pleasant but sometimes superficial state, and having influence, the ability to affect thoughts, feelings, and actions. The progression from likability to influence follows a systematic path that can be consciously developed. The first step beyond basic likability is establishing trust. While people may like you based on initial impressions and pleasant interactions, influence requires deeper credibility. Schafer identifies trust accelerators that transform likability into trust, demonstrating competence in areas relevant to the relationship, maintaining consistency between words and actions, showing vulnerability in appropriate, measured ways, following through on commitments, especially when difficult, respecting confidentiality and boundaries. Once trust is established, the pathway to influence involves creating value alignment. When people perceive that your interests and values align with theirs, influence flows naturally without resistance. Schafer recommends identifying and emphasizing genuine shared values rather than manufacturing false commonality. This authentic alignment creates the perception that your influence serves mutual benefit rather than selfish interest. Timing significantly impacts influence effectiveness. Schafer identifies what he calls influence windows, moments when people are particularly receptive to new ideas or perspectives. These windows often open during times of transition, uncertainty, success, or after you've just provided significant value. Recognizing and utilizing these optimal moments greatly enhances influence effectiveness. The presentation of ideas shapes their reception and impact. Schafer recommends framing suggestions in ways that connect to the other person's existing beliefs and priorities, rather than challenging them directly. By showing how your ideas represent extensions or applications of their existing views, rather than contradictions, you reduce resistance and increase receptivity. For significant influence, Schafer emphasizes the importance of inspiring rather than merely convincing. While logical arguments have their place, emotional engagement and vision creation typically generate stronger commitment. Stories, metaphors, and vivid examples create emotional connection to ideas, making them more memorable and motivating than abstract concepts or data alone. Reciprocity serves as a powerful influence accelerator. By consistently providing value before requesting action, you activate the deeply ingrained human tendency to reciprocate. Schafer cautions, however, that this reciprocity should develop naturally through genuine relationship rather than through calculated giving designed to create obligation. Another key insight involves the distinction between compliance and commitment. Compliance represents surface-level agreement without internal acceptance, while commitment reflects genuine adoption of ideas or values. While authority or pressure can generate compliance, only true influence creates lasting commitment. This difference explains why influence based on relationship and value alignment proves more durable than influence based on position or power. Schafer introduces the concept of influence momentum, the tendency for successful influence in small matters to facilitate subsequent influence in larger ones. By starting with minor requests or suggestions where agreement is likely, you establish patterns of positive response that carry forward into more significant matters. This progressive approach builds influence capacity over time without triggering resistance. The most sophisticated level of influence involves what Schafer calls identity-based influence. This occurs when your relationship and credibility are so established that accepting your influence becomes part of how the other person sees themselves. At this level, resistance diminishes because following your guidance aligns with their self-concept rather than challenging it. This depth of influence develops only through consistent value creation and trust building over extended periods. Throughout his discussion of influence, Schafer emphasizes that the most sustainable influence emerges from genuine positive relationship rather than tactical manipulation. While techniques can accelerate the process, lasting influence ultimately depends on actual value creation, authentic connection, and mutual benefit. The most powerful application of the like switch isn't merely making people like you, but developing relationships where your influence genuinely serves their interests. Conclusion: mastering the like switch. The ability to build rapport, establish trust, and develop influence represents perhaps the most fundamental meta skill for success across all domains of life. From professional advancement to personal relationships, from leadership effectiveness to everyday interactions, your ability to connect with others shapes your opportunities and impact. Schafer's approach transforms this seemingly mysterious social ability into a systematic process that can be learned, practiced, and mastered. By understanding the friendship formula, proximity plus frequency plus duration plus intensity, mastering nonverbal signals, developing strategic empathy, and applying the other principles outlined in the like switch, you can dramatically enhance your ability to build positive relationships with virtually anyone. The practical power of these techniques lies in their flexibility and universality. Whether you're interacting with colleagues, clients, friends, family members, or strangers, the fundamental principles remain constant while their specific application adapts to context. This versatility makes mastering these skills an investment that pays dividends across all areas of life. Beyond individual success, these skills contribute to collective well-being. In a world often characterized by polarization and conflict, the ability to build bridges across differences creates value that extends beyond personal benefit. By developing genuine understanding and connection with diverse others, you contribute to the social fabric that makes communities function effectively. The journey to mastery begins with conscious application of specific techniques, but ultimately leads to internalization, where these approaches become natural extensions of your authentic self rather than calculated tactics. With practice, the principles become integrated into your way of being rather than techniques you consciously deploy. Schafer encourages viewing relationship development as both an art and a science, informed by research and principles, but expressed through personal style and adapted to specific contexts. The most effective practitioners develop their own authentic expression of these universal principles rather than mechanically applying techniques. As you implement these approaches in your daily interactions, remain attentive to results and willing to adjust. Different individuals and contexts may require modified approaches or emphasis on different elements of the relationship-building process. This flexibility and responsiveness represents the hallmark of true interpersonal intelligence. Perhaps most importantly, remember that genuine interest in others cannot be entirely fabricated. While techniques can enhance connection, sustainable relationships ultimately require actual curiosity, empathy, and value creation. The most powerful application of these principles involves becoming genuinely more attentive to and invested in others rather than merely appearing to be. By mastering the like switch, you gain not just techniques but a deeper understanding of human social dynamics. This understanding transforms how you experience interactions, relationships, and community. What once seemed mysterious or unpredictable becomes comprehensible and navigable. This clarity empowers you to create the connections that enrich life and enable impact. If you found value in this exploration of relationship building and influence, please support our channel by liking this video, subscribing for more in-depth book summaries, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Which technique from the like switch do you find most applicable to your life? Have you experienced the power of these principles in your own relationships? Join the conversation and continue developing these essential human skills. Remember, you can purchase Jack Schafer's complete work through the link in the description below. Until next time, may your interactions be filled with genuine connection and positive influence.